Hey everyone. I have on my phone a long list of stuff to do, ideas, videos I want to make, demos and stuff like that. And one of the most out there ideas is one I called sequences as oscillators and oscillators as sequences. So the idea behind that is to use a capable sequencer, something that's capable of going at audio rate like this one. Any analog sequencer in reality will work. If you have a DFAM, if you have one of those big Doppler sequencers, anything that can run at audio rate will be perfectly suited for the job. So I want to use the sequencer to create the sound and the oscillators, which are usually more suited to the task, to be the one supplying control voltages to create notes and maybe gate patterns. So let's see if we can do anything musical with that as a starting point. Of course, I'll be using the voltage multistage, which if you follow the video I've been doing is probably always at the center of the patch. It's always the sequencer, it's always the module sending the gates, sending the CV to the modules. It was actually one of the first videos I made for this channel, something that kickstarted everything. So since then, I now have two sequencer selectors and two voltage multistage. Clearly, this is my favorite way of sequencing my system, but it's also capable of running at audio rate. There's even an integrated clock, so you can start. Usually it's clocked by my computer because when you make rhythmic music, you want everything to talk properly and in sync, but it's capable of going much, much faster than that until it's basically audio that's coming out of these two CV. If I plug a cable, this is very, very slow still. It's basically like listening to an LFO. Very clicky. But if you increase the clock, I get a tone. And if I change the CV row, it's not going to be the same tone. Basically what you have here is a wavetable oscillator, more or less. A graphic oscillator. Pretty primordial one, but still. You can crossfade between the two. And you can sequence the time knob with another sequencer, for example, or just an LFO. The only downside is this is probably mostly used as a sequencer, and the time doesn't go as fast as I'd like to really push it as an oscillator. But there's an easy workaround to this. It's just using any oscillator, preferably with a square waveform, as the clock source. And then it's the oscillator and its frequency that's clocking your sequencer. And if you want to change the frequency of the oscillator of the multistage, you just need to sequence the clock that is your square wave. But we'll go a bit further there afterwards. So this is the basic principle. It also works with the sequence selector, just that the sequence selector doesn't have in the built-in clock, but if you do the same thing, you have an oscillator as well, which is fun. It also works with the gate output, which is going to be a square wave or strange pulse something. Sure, it's endlessly more complicated to do that rather than just use a DPO or a complex oscillator of any kind. It's also the beauty of modular to be able to do that. That's clearly just for fun And let's see if we can get something usable out of all this. So I think you will have guessed it. This will be a bit patch heavy. Dumb ideas don't come cheap. What we need to do first is plug a square wave into the advanced input of the voltage multistage to clock it at audio rate. The voltage multistage is cycling so fast that it's producing a tone. Let's plug that into the mixer. Here's the tone. And basically what you have here is a wave-shapable oscillator. A graphic oscillator of sorts with 8 points. You can maybe change the reset point and it will of course change the sound. There's actually quite a lot of wave shaping options, but this is not under any CV control. And the tone will depend on the square wave you're clocking your oscillator with. So if I'm using an offset to push the DPO higher or lower, if it's so slow, then it's clocking it a bit like a standard sequencer. But that's not what we want here. But we don't want a static tone either. So let's run the output of the voltage multistage into the LXD, the one-stop shop solution to make everything sound good. We will use function to open our LXD. It would be way too easy to use the other voltage multistage to gate our function. What we're going to do here is use a low frequency oscillator to produce gates or patterns that we're going to send to function. When I said sequences as oscillators and oscillators as sequences, what I really meant was low frequency oscillators as sequences. It's much more easy to do something with a low frequency oscillator than with an audio rate oscillator. But there are ways you can do this even with an oscillator using like a sample and hold or analog shift register, but things are a bit more clear with an LFO. I have clocked my LFO with the division of my main clock, just so if we want to add, let's say, percussion or stuff like that later, something at least in rhythm. The very important thing here is to use Batumi, and really it's an advice that's useful for any application. Batumi is twice as powerful when used in conjunction with something like a control or voltage processor, when you can mix and invert and offset stuff, or something like the quadruple. Basically, if you have a modular, you have one of these modules or one of these kind of modules in your modular already. Let's mix and match square waves from Batumi to create a pattern. If I take the output of this and gate function, we have a gated sequence, but it's either on or off, and we would like something a bit more complicated. So let's mix outputs. I'm using the phase mode in Batumi, which allows us to have everything synced, but with different phase. They all trigger at different moments. But this is still a static tone. We want to try to pitch sequence the oscillator. For this, we're going to use Batumi again. So I've used the left square wave to pitch sequence my DPO, which is actually clocking or sequencing my voltage multistage. It's either higher or lower, but again, it's just an on-off signal. It's a square wave. So we want something a bit different. Let's try and use a sine wave, for example. Then it's a bit wobbly, feeling seasick. Then it's just a matter of mixing. And when you think about it, this sort of sounds like a classic sequencer would do on the voltage multistage with some slides and a slew, for example. It's not that much different. Especially when you add in some delay. This is our sequence. It's a bit simple, for sure, but we're all doing it just with Batumi and TPO. Of course, die-hard modular users who've been doing this since the invention of modular synth. We'll be very familiar with the technique of using LFOs and sample and holds to create notes rather than just sequencer. But in a moment where modular synths are more popular than ever, but when most modular systems tend to look quite the same, it's important to remember that a modular synth is made of versatile and useful building blocks, which you can use in the obvious ways, but also use in the less obvious ways. And you don't need a mega battleship sequencer to get going. If you have an LFO, attenuators, offset, a shift register or a sample and hold, you got yourself a sequencer. Usually I use the gates outputs of the voltage multistage to clock the sequence selector to have some modulation going around, but here I can't because this is running at audio rate, so this will also run pretty fast. What I can do instead is just use a clock output of my clock divider. I want to use an output from the sequence selector to modulate the function. Which makes it sound pretty techno if you ask me. To the point where if you add a little kick, it starts to be pretty convincing. Just for fun, we can also run the output into a filter. Let's use the beautiful dual for pole by Verbos, somewhat of the less loved member of the Verbos family, but still a very worthy member. And we can of course use the output of function to modulate this. And why not use an LFO from Batumi that's free to modulate it further. Once again, we need to be aware of the risk of over-modulating everything, but I think this just adds some movements without being crazy. Let's bring back our kick. This sequence sort of has a drunken feeling, or I don't really know what it is, but it's different enough that it warrants all this work. And I don't know, it's fun that, you know, this sequencer row is actually the one making the sounds. And nothing stops you from moving the sliders. If you're feeling fancy, you can crossfade in between the two outputs, because this is actually a second oscillator. Instead of an LFO to modulate our low-pass filter, we can have a go with audio rate modulation to add harmonics. I have to admit, it sounds pretty good. There are, of course, plenty of other things to try with your sequencer as an oscillator. You can FM a sequencer with another sequencer, with a VCA in the middle, trying to get other tones. Really, I think it's worth trying just to see what kind of sounds your sequencer has inside. Remember that it's possible to do these things with such modules, and that sometimes it's fun to break out of the old ways, and after all, it's modular, so why not try something new? Why not try something like that today where you're not feeling inspired? Someday where nothing comes close to working. Unpatch everything and try to use the module you're used to in a completely different way. That might spark some new creativity. So I hope this video was fun to watch, and I'll see you in the next one. This time it's definitely gonna be a demo. See you soon. Cheers.